The smallest dragon in the Crimson Peaks was the only one who could save an entire kingdom, but no one believed he could even light a candle until the day the mountains froze and the giants failed. High above the clouds, where mountains pierced the sky like ancient blades, stood the Crimson Peaks, a kingdom ruled by dragons. Not small dragons, but colossal creatures with jewel-bright scales and wings wide enough to shadow entire forests. When they roared, the mountains trembled. When they breathed fire, the night sky burned like the sun. But among these mighty giants, there was one tiny exception: Ignis, a dragon so small he could curl up inside a teacup. His dusty orange scales barely shimmered in the light. His wings looked delicate, almost like butterfly glass. And his fire, just a tiny glowing spark, no bigger than a firefly. The elder dragons laughed whenever they saw him. "Careful, Ignis," they would rumble. "One sneeze from you might be the weakest flame in history." The others laughed with them, but Ignis never argued. He simply lowered his head and looked toward the valley below, because more than anything, he wanted to matter. Far beneath the Crimson Peaks stretched a peaceful valley filled with forest animals: rabbits, deer, bears. Tiny glowing insects drifted through the trees like floating stars. And every year before winter arrived, the dragons performed an ancient ritual. Deep inside a sacred cave rested the Hearth Stone, a massive crystal filled with ancient magic. When dragon fire touched the crystal, it released warmth across the entire valley, protecting every creature from the deadly winter freeze. But this year, winter came early. The sky darkened without warning. A monstrous storm swallowed the mountains. Snow crashed through the forests. Ice spread across the trees like living fingers. And slowly, the valley began to freeze. The elder dragons rushed toward the Hearth Cave, but when they arrived, something was terribly wrong. A violent landslide had sealed the cave entrance shut. Massive boulders blocked the path. Thick, frozen walls of ice covered every opening. Only one tiny crack remained, too small for any dragon to enter. Goliath stepped forward, the largest and strongest dragon in all the Crimson Peaks. His enormous crimson wings spread across the storm like thunderclouds. With a mighty roar, he slammed his tail against the rocks. The mountain shook, but the cave did not open. Another dragon unleashed a storm of fire hot enough to melt steel, but the freezing wind howled back violently, swallowing the flames whole. For the first time in many years, the great dragons stood helpless. Below them, the forest animals huddled together in fear. Tiny rabbits trembled beneath frozen roots. Mother bears wrapped themselves around their cubs. The cold was winning. And Ignis watched everything from above. The frightened animals, the silent dragons, the dying warmth of the valley. Something inside the tiny dragon suddenly changed. "I can't do nothing," he whispered softly. Before anyone realized what he was doing, Ignis spread his tiny butterfly wings and flew toward the crack in the cave. "Ignis, stop!" one of the elder dragons roared. "The storm will freeze you!" But Ignis never turned back. A moment later, he disappeared into the darkness. Inside the cave, everything became silent. Cold air sliced against his tiny wings. The wind screamed through the tunnels like a living creature. Massive shadows stretched across the walls. Ignis trembled. He was so small, so fragile, so alone. For one terrible moment, he wanted to turn around. Then he heard them, the faint cries of the animals outside, shivering, waiting, hoping. Ignis closed his eyes tightly and kept moving forward. He climbed over jagged stones, slipped beneath frozen ice, pushed himself deeper into the darkness, until finally he saw it, the Hearth Stone. But the great crystal was completely frozen, dark, silent, empty. Ignis slowly climbed onto the giant crystal. His tiny body shook from the cold. The little spark near his snout flickered weakly. "I can't be strong like them," he whispered, "but I can still try." He closed his eyes and thought about the valley, the rabbits, the bears, the warmth they deserved. Then Ignis took one small breath and released his fire. A tiny glowing spark floated gently into the freezing air. For a moment, nothing happened. Then, the spark began to glow brighter, softly, warmly, golden. The Hearthstone responded. A pulse of light spread across the crystal, then another and another, until suddenly a massive wave of radiant golden energy exploded through the cave. The Hearthstone had awakened. Warmth rushed across the valley like sunlight after endless winter. Ice melted from the trees, snow turned to sparkling water, the freezing wind vanished into silence, and life returned to the kingdom once more. Outside the cave, the great dragon stood frozen in awe. Goliath slowly lowered his massive head, not in command, but in respect. And when Ignis finally stepped out of the cave, no one laughed anymore. The forest animals cheered with joy. The dragons bowed before the tiny orange dragon. And for the very first time in his life, Ignis no longer felt small. Because true strength was never about size, and the strongest fire in the world doesn't always roar. Sometimes it begins as the smallest spark.